Guys, so let's go into section 6.3. So now what we're going to do is look at real GDP over time. Now that we know what real GDP is, like the actual production that's going on, not the production with inflation, okay, we're going to be looking at it over time, and we can look at the growth rates, okay, because governments report GDP as an annualized rate. So basically, whenever you look at the news and they say GDP has increased by 3.5%, what they're trying to say is that for the year, GDP has grown by 3.5%. Remember that new minus old divided by old? That's what they're doing. They're telling you based off of last time they measured to this time, there's been a growth of 3.5%. All right, so now you know what they're talking about. Now, they also could do this. They also could be analyzing growth in a quarter. Now, when I say a quarter, I'm talking about a quarter of a year. And so that would be 3 months. So what they could do is they could look at the GDP from January, February, March, and that was Q1. And if GDP grew by 1%, then they would say, okay, let's take that real GDP for that quarter, 1%, and multiply it by 4. And that would be the annualized rate. So basically, you have 1% for Q1 times 4, so the year would be 4%. So that's what governments will do, is they will report the annualized rate. So they would take the quarter growth, multiply it by 4 to get the annual growth. Now, the true annual growth, right, would be looking at January to December. Okay, but sometimes we don't want to wait that long to figure out if we're growing or shrinking. So what we'll do is we'll look at quarters to figure out what is happening throughout the year. Because throughout the year, we're going to have different changes that are going on. We could have a recession. A recession is going to be where you're having a significant decline in the GDP. So basically, if you're looking at January to March, and then all of a sudden you see GDP is going down, okay, then that would be more of a recession. Like if it decreased a lot in January and March, like for instance COVID, right? Instantly production just stopped in the country. So there was a big drop in real GDP. So that caused a recession. Okay? A depression is just going to be a very lengthy recession. Okay? So basically, if it lasted a long time, that would be a depression, like in the 1930s. Okay? So real GDP is important because it is highly correlated with other measures of economic activity, such as employment and unemployment. Basically, if they're saying that GDP is growing, right, then that means you're making more stuff. How can you make more stuff? You have more people to make it. So if real GDP is going up, that could mean you have high employment and low unemployment. So when real GDP rises, so does employment. Right? So that's the thinking here, is that when we're looking at real GDP, we're looking at the growth, right? Then we can look at, well, what else is happening? Okay? Now, in measuring over time, okay, where I talked about the recession, how the real GDP is going down, there's actually a word for that, because we do have a thing called business cycles. So we're going to have good times and bad times throughout the year. We're going to have some times of expansion. Okay, expansions are going to be wherever the real GDP is increasing. So when, like it's Christmas time, right? People are trying to buy a lot of gifts. Okay, then they're buying a lot of things. That's increasing the production. So that would be an expansion, where real GDP is going up. Okay, so expansion is where real GDP is increasing. Okay, now eventually what's going to happen is right after Christmas, okay, like Everybody has bought everything they need. Then what happens right after Christmas? Nobody needs to buy anything anymore, right? So there's this transition from buying so much stuff to not buying it. And that would mean there's a peak. So this is the top of the expansion period. Basically, real GDP has reached its maximum. Okay. So the peak during the business cycle, the highest point of output, okay, before a contraction. Okay. A contraction is where real GDP is getting smaller. So I like to think about a expansion, like you're getting bigger, like a balloon, and then contraction is where you're getting smaller. Okay, and the contraction is where real GDP is decreasing. So contraction is where real GDP is going down. And most of the time we can't see this if we were to look at December, January, right? So it's going to go up, down, and then, we're having summertime, so it's going to go back up again, right? So expansion, peak, contraction. And then what we're going to happen at the bottom here, okay? So basically we're done contracting. That's going to be a word called the trough. Now a trough is during the business cycle where it's the lowest point of the output in a recession or in a contraction. Okay, because after you're at the bottom of the hill, what can you do? You can increase. Okay, so this is what it's going to look like. You're having an expansion. You're going to get to the peak. You're going to have a contraction where real GDP is decreasing, and then you're going to have a trough. Then right after that, so you're down here. Okay, so this is your GDP, and then all of a sudden you start to increase. So real GDP is increasing. All right. So that's what's happening as an expansion. And then we have a peak, and then we have a contraction. So that's what's happening. We are having expansion, peak, contraction, trough all the time. It's going to go up, down, all the time. So that is the cycle. A peak, a recession will last from basically, if it's a dramatic decrease, okay, it's going to last that long. As long as you are contracting, that's a recession. Like if it's like 2 quarters, okay, that's going to be a recession. So if you are contracting for 6 months, that's a recession. Now, as soon as we have an expansion, the recession is over. You are actually making more things. Okay? So, therefore, right, you're having expansion, peak, contraction. Well, where does the growth actually happen? The growth is going to happen over time. So if we looked from the 1920s to 2020, to 2020, right, we had peaks and contractions and troughs and expansions throughout that time. And over time, we had longer expansions than contractions. So an expansion would last on average, 8 months, and a contraction would last 4 months. So if you did that every year, you had longer expansions than contractions. And if you were expanding more than contracting, you will have economic growth. You will have long-term growth. Looking here, right, where you start and where you ended, right, you are increasing over time. So that's where the long-term growth comes in. All right, so the main thing I want you to understand is the business cycle. Expansion, peak, contraction, trough. It all depends on what's happening with real GDP. When we look from beginning to end, you will see how real GDP is increasing. That's the growth. Okay? And the next one we'll look at different countries. I'll see you there.